you're making massive changes in the DNA. What if you're causing problems that we don't yet know how to evaluate? He couldn't answer that question, but he could only come back by saying, well, we need genetic engineering to increase the productivity, to feed the world. And I knew he was sincere, but I knew he was wrong. In fact, one of the largest single report in the world, years to do, 400 scientists, major organizations concluded that genetic engineering has absolutely no advantages right now for developing countries and feeding the world. And yet that's the rhetoric we hear day after day from the biotech industry because it sells, not because it's true.
How many countries are producing genetically engineered crops right now?
Well, largely it's 6. United States, Canada, Argentina, China, India, and Brazil. And they produce, say, 99% of all the crops. And there's basically 2 traits. The primary trait is crops engineered not to die when sprayed with herbicide. The story is Monsanto scientists found bacteria growing in a chemical waste dump near their factory that was not dying in the presence of Roundup herbicide. So they figured, let's put it in the food supply. So they took the gene from the bacteria and put it into soy, corn, cotton, and canola, and sugar beets. And now you can spray the heck out of those fields, killing all the plant biodiversity, and only the GM crop survives. Now, when they fed the genetically modified Roundup-ready soybean to humans, the only human feeding study ever conducted showed that inside the gut bacteria in the human beings was the gene that they found in the bacteria from the chemical waste dump. It had somehow transferred from the soy into the DNA of the bacteria living inside us, and it continued to function, producing genetically modified proteins that could be allergenic or toxic. Now, this is a really serious issue. I tell this to medical conferences all the time, and they come up to me and they say, we've seen a lot of very serious gastrointestinal problems in the United States since around 1996 when these products were introduced.
Interesting.
And I tell them about the corn that's engineered to produce its own pesticide, this Bt toxin, how mice that have been fed it have all sorts of problems, rats, and it's related to farmers say that animals have gotten sterile and died, etc., and that if you eat a genetically engineered corn chip or a corn tortilla, and if the gene that produces the Bt toxin were to transfer to your gut bacteria, it might transform it into living pesticide factories. So it's really horrific. And I mean, there's a study that they fed genetically modified soy to female rats. This was a Russian National Academy of scientists who did it, and more than half of the offspring of the rats died within 3 weeks. They fed it to, and also the offspring were smaller and couldn't reproduce. They fed it to male rats, and the testicles changed color. In Italy, they fed genetically modified soy to mice. Their testicles changed the structure and function. The young sperm cells were damaged, and the offspring embryos changed their DNA expression. And then they fed, and as I mentioned earlier, they fed other mice genetically modified corn, and the more corn they fed them, the less babies they had, and the smaller the babies were.
If we didn't have GMOs and we went all natural again, as we did years ago, would we still have enough food to take care of the planet?
Oh, yeah. GMOs actually, on the average, decrease yield. Genetically modified soy reduces yield by 5 to 10%, according to most independent research. It allows farmers to do labor saving because they can spray Roundup herbicide rather than picking the weeds, but it doesn't improve the production. In fact, what improves production most is sustainable agriculture, not grown on monocultures, but polycultures, where they have lots of different crops growing in the acres, because the total amount of tonnage of food is much higher in those circumstances. So if we're really serious about feeding the world, we actually have more food per person than any time in human history, about 4.3 pounds per person per day. So it's not productivity per se, on average, that's the problem. We still have over, 25, 30,000 people that die each day from malnutrition and starvation. It's not because of overall lack of production. And certainly GMOs are one of the worst technologies to try and use to fix the situation because they're very, very unsafe, they're unreliable, and also they take money away from more appropriate technologies.
What percent of GMOs are fed directly to animals and then or given to us?
A lot. The most of it gets fed to animals. I mean, animals in the United States largely get soy and corn. However, we have a lot of soy and corn derivatives in small amounts, highly processed. So you have the soy lecithin, the soy protein isolate, the corn syrup, the corn flour, the soy oil, the corn oil. So you get this in a lot of our foods, but it's in smaller concentrations. With the animals, you get it in much larger concentrations, and that's where you see some problems. I was in a village in India in January, and they were allowing their buffalo to graze on cotton plants after harvest. But on January 3rd last year, they allowed their buffalo to graze on BT, genetically modified cotton, engineered to produce the BT toxin, for one day. They ate the crop all day, and the next day they were unconscious or unable to move, and 3 days later all 13 buffalo were dead.
Oh, my gosh. Now, what % of the fields of corn and soy are GMOs?
You got about 92% of the soy, about 73% of the corn, maybe 87% of the cotton, and maybe 85% of the canola in the United States and Canada. So,
are GMOs?
Yes.
That's huge.
It's absolutely huge. It's remarkable. It's basically taken over those crops.
Just in the last 10 years?
Yes.
And if this trend continues, it'll be close to 100%.
Well, what's happening is there's kind of a backlash by nature. When you use all that herbicide in these herbicide-tolerant crops, the weeds develop resistance. And so if you look at the paper right now, there's this huge outbreak of herbicide-tolerant pigweed, like the nightmare weed, all throughout the South. So they've actually given up, 10,000 acres here and there. They've got about 100,000 acres that have totally infested. And so they're having to, do amazing measures. So the technology itself is destroying its own efficacy.
And what good would it be then if what it's trying to do is eradicate weeds in its own little way? If the weeds won't go away, what good is the GMO?
Exactly. And of course, when you spray so much of the Roundup herbicide on the crops, you end up with more herbicide residues in the crops, which they have their own poisonous effects. In fact, Roundup was a subject of some recent studies linked to cancer, linked to birth defects in amphibians, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not the healthy, biodegradable chemical that Monsanto wants us to believe. There's a lot of evidence to the contrary.
It's a floating format tonight, so we'll take phone calls next with Jeffrey Smith right here on Coast to Coast AM.